Chapter 12. A Long Walk. When Quincy found us, I knew he was gone. I knew it, and I mourned, for he was a good and kind man. At the time, there seemed to be so few of them left. She showed up alone, no mama and no brother. I can only guess at what happened after we left. Maybe we were tracked. Maybe it was just bad luck. I'll never know. But my heart jumped when I saw her. I named her Quincy right there on that bridge, moments after we recognized her loping along, her nose to the ground, sussing out where we had trekked in the 2 weeks since we'd last seen her. I suppose I could have been more original, but I saw the sign on the bridge leading into the town of Quincy and figured it was fate. I'm thankful she found us. She ended up saving my life more times than I can remember. Jess's journal.
Clinton, shit, you girls got one hell of a long walk ahead of you. The grizzled old man laughed. Sure you don't want to stay here with me?
He winked at them. It was a tense few hours since first meeting, but Arno Cooper,
everyone around here just calls me Coop,
appeared relatively harmless. It helped that he hadn't been armed with a gun, and they were, both girls ready to draw blood rather than pass the time of day. Being back on the road nearly 3 weeks now hadn't dulled them at all. They were jumpy and scared, so they knew he was there long before he was aware of them. He had been muttering to himself, picking burrs off of his shirt, slapping at the occasional mosquito and inspecting some traps along the same creek the girls had been following for the past 3 days. Jess had seen him first and wanted to avoid him. She suggested tracking around in a broad circle, but the woods were thick with black locust trees. These nightmarish trees were loaded with sharp spines on their branches. They had stumbled into a dense thicket of the trees a week or so ago, and been rewarded by several painful, bloody wounds before they had managed to escape to open ground. Erin was far braver. She wanted to know where they were, and how far they had to go to get to Clinton. Without a map, the next best thing was asking someone. They had both agreed to tell no one of their ultimate destination. If anyone was looking for them, or if the soldiers took a turn back northwest, they reasoned that it would be better for them to be heading for Clinton. After all, that was familiar enough country to get them the rest of the way home to Belton. And right at the moment they came to an agreement, the dog lying on the ground near the old man had woken up, let out a short bark, and pointed right at them. It was early June, and the day was already uncomfortably warm. If you looked a distance away, you could see the waves of heat pulsing through the air. Old Coop, who turned out to be an experienced trapper, had managed to snare a skunk, 2 squirrels, and a large groundhog in his traps. The skunk smell was overwhelming at first. The girls' eyes watered from their vantage point only a few yards away. He had offered to share his bounty, and their store of smoked fish had run out 2 days ago. By now, their growling, empty stomachs were stronger, and no doubt louder than their fear. So they stood back and watched as he field-dressed the catch, started a small campfire, and talked endlessly. In a way, it was a comfort to hear another voice. He spoke of troop movements, and then turned autobiographical. So my Alice, she passed away a few months after Black Monday, and my boy Scott joined up with the army not long after. Blood dripped from his fingers as he skinned the skunk. I haven't heard nothing in over 2 years from him, but we was never what you'd call close. He waved a gore-covered finger at Erin. Fetch us some water from the creek there, would you, missy? A streak of blood smeared across his cheek as he wiped the sweat away. Erin warily took the indicated bucket and headed for the stream, never looking away from the old man. He slowed in his constant patter, took a long look at Jess and asked, Them soldiers knock you up, girl? Jess bristled and said nothing. He took her silence for confirmation and said, My Alice, she had herself an affair, got herself knocked up. The man was worthless, wouldn't stand by her, and took the next greyhound out of town after I came and, talked to him. I could have divorced her, but I didn't. I stuck by her, and she birthed that child. He stopped and smiled crookedly at Jess. We named her Tiffany, and I swear to you I never loved a child more than I loved that little girl.
Now, my boy Scott, he was some 5 years older than his little sister. He was my own flesh and blood, but he and me, we was always strangers living in the same house."
Erin had returned and was listening quietly, the pail of water sloshing in her hands. He turned and gestured for her to put it near the campfire, and Jess spoke for the first time, her finger slowly easing off of the large hunting knife near her side.
"So what happened to her?"
The old man's hands stopped for a moment in their work. He stopped and looked up at Jess and said,
"Same as what happened to you girls, 'ceptin' my girl ain't never come back."
His grizzled and lined face twisted in pain, and he looked down at the small bloody creature in his hands.
"I heard she gave him hell, got one of 'em's knives from him, sneaky-like, and cut up one of the bastards nice and good. They killed her for it after they were done using her, then dumped her like she was a piece of trash."
He took a deep breath, swatting at a hovering mosquito, and continued.
"I've been tracking 'em since she went missing. See, she'd been in town visiting a friend of hers the day they blew through. 3 days later, I found her body, and I found one of 'em who was too shot up to fight. They'd left him behind, too. Damn, when I was in the service, you didn't run off and leave your men, and you sure didn't rape innocent young girls. Anyways, he told me everything afore he died."
Cooper's eyes were red and bloodshot when he looked back up.
I'm just an old man. I wanted to kill 'em all, but instead I took her back home and buried her next to her mama. Thank God my Alice weren't alive to see what they did to her baby."
He shook his head, bent back to skinning, and repeated,
"I'm just an old man. God forgive me, I'm just an old man."
Erin and Jess exchanged glances. It was a beautiful summer day, hot, even in the shade. Both the girls' skins were tanned and brown. In another space and time, you would think summer break from school, swimming pools, guys, and even a party or two. Above them, the clouds were white and fluffy with just a hint of gray. The rain would come tonight, like it had each evening before, and when it did, it would sink blissfully into the earth and add to the humidity the following day. How could it be so beautiful out when there was so much loss and heartache? The sun shone overhead and the birds sang. Life went on, and it seemed so impudent, as if life was laughing at their traumas and dismissing them as irrelevant. In the shade of the trees near the creek, with only the mosquitoes to harass them, they felt relatively safe. Here was a man who had lost someone. He hurt just as they hurt, and what was to be done? What measure of justice would he ever receive? Cooper was just another lonely old man, his world crushed by events beyond his control in a world gone mad. The old man led the way back up the creek to a small double-wide and a handful of outbuildings in various stages of disrepair. Several chickens clucked and scuttled about in a fenced section of the yard, with a small chicken coop attached. The mobile home had seen better days. 2 of the windows had been smashed, and Coop had simply nailed plywood over them. He shrugged. "Ain't much in the way of supplies for fixing the windows around here no more, so I just did what I could. It leaks a little when it rains." He had a solid patch of garden, filled with green beans, peas, and a multitude of other plants.
"What I don't like, I just barter."
He grinned.
"I ain't terribly fond of watermelon, for instance, but my Alice always growed it, and so I just kept it up. I got a neighbor up the way who is particularly skilled at bagging turkeys. I make sure he's got plenty of watermelon in the summer, and he takes care to see I got me a turkey or 2 each winter. It all works out."
It was a quiet place. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful, and they reveled in the comfort of sleeping in an honest-to-God, full-size bed that had room enough for both of them. In the end, they would spend 2 weeks with old Coop, in his small ramshackle mobile home a mile to the north of the creek where they had found him. They stayed in Tiffany's room, not willing to be separated, still not willing to trust even a beaten-down, grizzled old man. With his hospitality came changes of clothes and shoes in both girls' sizes. Scott's shoes had fit Erin, and Tiffany's had fit Jess. Finally, they were able to have something different than the ragged remains of those hated Western Front uniforms. The uniforms were stained and dirty anyway, stiff from being worn day in and day out, and only hand-washed and hung to dry when the days were warm enough to go without while they dried. They burned them at the first opportunity. Tiffany had been both girls' size, but certainly not their taste. Hers ran to sparkly sequin tops and lots of pink. She must have been a real girly girl in her clothing and decor. Perhaps that was what made it rather shocking for the girls to imagine her actually taking a knife and killing a man. Jess found that Scott's spare clothes were more accommodating of her swelling belly, and old Cooper assured her that they were welcome to any of the clothing they wanted from his children's rooms. They fished and stocked up on meat from Cooper's traps, and ate fresh peas and strawberries which seemed to grow overnight in the raised beds behind the old man's trailer. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the 12th day, both girls found themselves at ease with Cooper. Aaron sat cross-legged on the ground, in a pink crop top with princess emblazoned upon it in sequins, while Jess relaxed in a lawn chair in camouflage fatigues and a giant black insane clown posse t-shirt. She winced as the baby rolled and kicked inside her, pressing sharply on her full, it always seemed full these days, bladder. She turned to her left, reached down and scratched behind the girl pup's ears. Cooper had just 2 of them left. The puppies were 10 weeks old. They frolicked around the property, long legs and lean bodies, still awkward as they ran. They cried out with piteous yaps when the old man would tie them up and take their mother away with him to go trapping. One of them, the girl pup, had taken a shine to Jess and kept seeking her out, butting her head against Jess's hand and insisting on following her everywhere. Her liquid brown eyes stared up at Jess, and her tongue would frantically lick the air as Jess bent close and stroked the puppy's soft fur. The pup's fur was brown with patches of white, and she had huge, floppy ears that perked up with interest at the smallest sound from Jess. Each morning, the little pup was the first to greet Jess, and she howled at night when old Coop locked her up with the others in the dog run. How Jess wished she could take the pup with her, but it was impossible. They barely had enough food for themselves, much less a growing puppy. She met Aaron's gaze and nodded to her friend. They had talked about it the night before. It was time to move on. Cooper had just finished telling a funny joke, and Aaron's smile dropped. Her face grew serious and her laughter was cut short. She cleared her throat. We need to get back on the road again, Coop. The old man fell silent, looked at the ground, and said nothing. Aaron continued. We've got to go home, you know, to find out if any one of our friends or family managed to stay alive. Cooper looked like he was about to object, or to try to talk them out of it. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came out of his throat. He struggled silently for a moment, and tried to collect his thoughts before speaking. It was obvious to both of them how much he had enjoyed having them there, and how desperately lonely the old man was. When the words did come, his voice sounded rough and strained. Well, of course y'all gotta go. I knew you'd be heading on once you got some rest in. You heading out tomorrow? Jess's throat felt tight. Cooper was a decent man, the first either of them had seen in a long time. He was a little rough around the edges, but deep inside there rested a good, kind soul. Yeah, tomorrow. The old man nodded. Well, y'all need something better than that rifle and one lonely box of ammo. He got up and ducked into the trailer, rummaged inside a cabinet, and returned with several boxes under his arm, and sat back down in his weather-beaten wood chair. He tossed a box of shells to Aaron. They were 22s, a full box of them. Aaron grinned like she'd been handed gold, but Cooper wasn't done yet. Y'all need something small and easy to conceal, like this little lady. He reached into the box and pulled out a revolver, with inlaid wood in the handle and black steel. He handed it to Jess. She ran her hands over it. It wasn't a new gun, but it had been well cared for. It smelled sharply of cleaning fluid, and the wood felt as smooth as silk. He showed her how to pull it apart, and pointed out the grip safety on the back strap. She looked up and saw Coop's eyes steady on her. Smith & Wesson, Model 40 Centennial. She's small, easy to hide in your pocket, but I found a holster for her. I used to take my Tiffany target shooting with this little lady. She takes 5 rounds, and you got about 30 rounds of 38s left in that there box.
You keep her with you at all times. Keep her loaded. Will you do that, Missy?"
Jess nodded, unable to speak, reminded suddenly of her dad. This man looked nothing like her dad, but he was a father through and through. You can tell that about some people. They are the people who change irrevocably when parenthood visits them. They never stop caring, never stop seeing their own children in strangers' faces. She struggled up from the lawn chair, leaned over and hugged the old man, and went inside the trailer. She suddenly felt exhausted, and she didn't trust herself not to cry. She lay down in Tiffany's frilly pink bed and closed her eyes. Outside, she could hear Aaron and Coop talking, too quiet to be heard. By the time Aaron joined her in bed, Jess was sound asleep. Jess and Aaron were both up with the dawn. They weren't surprised to see old Coop awake as well, and he had already brewed up a large pot of his dwindling stash of coffee and baked some biscuits for them to eat and take on the road. They had packed extra changes of clothes, and Aaron was sporting hot pants and a crop top with "Spoiled Rotten" spelled out in a rainbow of shiny letters across the front. She had the rifle slung across her back, and Jess had her shiny revolver in a holster strapped to her fatigues. The pups were tied up, the little female crying and lunging at her lead, trying to escape and join the girls. Jess knelt down and hugged the pup close, felt her warm body writhe against her, and the dog's tiny tongue lick her desperately. Somehow, the pup knew she was leaving. The sun was out, and it was time to go. Coop reached out and hugged Aaron.
"You stay safe now, you hear me, girlie?"
Aaron smiled and thanked him, and then it was Jess's turn. He hugged her, then reached out and put a rough, gnarled hand firmly on her rounded belly. She nearly jerked away, but the sad look in his eyes stopped her.
"Jessie girl, listen to me now and humor an old man."
She stilled and looked back into his eyes.
"This baby and you, it ain't done nothing. It ain't asked to be here, and it's as innocent as one of God's lambs."
Even now, with it so obvious what was happening, she hated to think about it and tried to pull away. But Coop persisted.
"I know you think this ain't what you want, and I can't blame you, girl, if you think you hate this creature inside you, but it's a blessing, and someday you'll see it that way."
He held her gaze with his and said,
"Children's are blessings. They are the gift God gives us to tell us the world ain't all pain and death and loneliness."
His eyes blurred with tears.
"I hold my children in my heart and think of them each day, so you remember what I said when this child comes out of you. Will you remember that, Jessie?"
His features blurred as the tears leaked from her eyes and ran down her face. For that moment, she let them fall. She was so damned scared, and he knew it. He understood it somehow, and she felt like curling up in his arms and never leaving this quiet place. Instead, she nodded tearfully and hugged him, and managed to croak out,
"Thanks."
Tears blurring both of their vision, the girls set out along the creek, large new backpacks full of food and supplies slung to their backs. The old man stood there for a long time, long after they had disappeared from sight, before slowly turning away and returning to his lonely, empty home.